jiġi mwassal bl-isbaħ xewqat ta' Beauty Wisdom, il-Katalan, Game Breaker u Your Beauty Essence. Antonello Abela jselmilkom jagħtikom merħba 56 programm s-sensiela botta u risposta. Illum qegħdin taraw naqra affarijiet differenti li m'għandix bis-soltu ġenuflessjoni ta' nies madwari, le m'iniex biex nakum ingravata, għandhom tas-soltu dan għaliex il-twist ta' dal-programm li irrikordjat jumejn ilu. Illum ġas qed nagħmel introduzzjoni u konklużjoni qasira fl-aħħar. Iva, ħbib tiegħi il-Kamra Sportiva, tim tal-Dipartiment tal-Formula wieħed tal-Kamra Sportiva bi pjaċir illum ħabbar programm speċjali fejn fih jiena u Andrew Zarb intervistajna bniedem prominenti fil-kamp tal-ġurnalizmu tal-Formula wieħed modern qed nirreferu għal Ben Edwards, kommentatur tal-stazzjoni uffiċjali tal-Formula wieħed F1 TV, kien ukoll ikkummentat liela għall-istazzjoni Ingliż Channel 4 ukoll u illum bi pjaċir kbir nixtieq nwassal din l-intervista li jiena u Andrew għamilnilu propju nhar it-tlieta li għaddew lejliet li bedew it-testijiet li hemm bħalissa fuq il-Bahrejn. Ovvjament min irid jikkummenta fuq dak li qed jintqal min-naħa ta' Ben Edwards, go ahead ta' voldieri. Mhux se nżommukom aħna biss, naħseb illi għalissa diġà parlajt iżżejjed u tajb illi nħalli l-mikrofonu fidejn Ben Edwards appuntu fidejn Andrew li għamilnilu din l-intervista nhar it-tlieta. Għadna sta tinħeġġukom biex kif jgħidu l-Ingliżi settle down, ħudu pjaċir isimgħu din l-intervista li ser tkun bl-Ingliż u naraw naqra Ben Edwards x'għandu xejdilna lejliet il-bidu tal-Kampjonat Dinji tal-Formula wieħed. Ben, first of all, we would like to welcome you to our show. It is an honor for us to have this chat with you. And firstly, we would like to open our discussion by talking about this winter's biggest news. The announcement of Sir Lewis Hamilton's move to Ferrari at the end of the season. How did you react to this news, first of all? And secondly, how do you think this will affect the driver market?
Oh, it's such an interesting one. And so many people got back to me and said, wow, what news is this? You know, that Lewis Hamilton is going to go to Ferrari next year. It's a big story, of course it is. And there's been talk about him going to Ferrari for years on and off, you know, because he's always obviously had a passion for driving for Ferrari. And we've seen so many champions go to Ferrari with the hope that they're going to be champions with them. Doesn't always work. I mean, you know, you look at Fernando Alonso, you look at Sebastian Vettel, didn't work for them. But it is a big story. And yes, I think for all of us F1 fans, it's going to be fascinating to see how Lewis gets on when he goes to Ferrari and is such a key part of such a huge part of Formula One, the big team that so many people are passionate about.
In fact, here in Malta, we were really shocked, but the irony is this, those tifosi, which until some time ago they used to criticize Hamilton, now they've already starting seeing him as the Messiah, which is a bit ironic. And with regards to how will the transfer market develop, because now we have a lot of drivers who are looking for a seat, like Carlos Sainz, Albon, Alonso, the same Sergio Perez.
There's the vacancy of the Mercedes seat, Antonello, after all.
Exactly.
Which is a prestigious seat in Formula One, I would say, as well.
And the Red Bull seat for the moment, let's say for the moment.
No, it makes for a fascinating time. I mean, I always found it a bit strange that we got to the end of 2023 with no driver changes for 2024. It's very rare that you don't get any. And now we're going completely a different way because we're going through 2024 and we're already in, we haven't even started the year yet. And we're all fascinated about who's going to go where. And it is a big deal, you know, because these contracts worth fortunes for some people, whether you can get long contracts or short contracts, and some key drivers, as you mentioned, you know, Carlos Sainz losing his position at Ferrari because that's where Lewis Hamilton is going. What's he going to get out of it? Well, I think Carlos has some good options. Whether he would be chosen by Mercedes for a complete swap, I'm not sure. It's not impossible because I think they've got a lot of faith in George Russell. And I think George has clearly got huge talent. Carlos is, I think, a brilliant driver, maybe a great number two. Sometimes he doesn't, even though he was the only driver to win a race last year, apart from a Red Bull driver, he's still, you know, there is that feeling sometimes that he's not the ultimate quickest. So he could be right, but there are lots of options. And I think Carlos could end up elsewhere. There are so many different options out there. And as you mentioned, Fernando Alonso, I mean, what an opportunity it could be for Fernando to go to Mercedes, having gone to various teams and made some very quick decisions. I mean, that move when he went from Alpine to Aston Martin, he's very smart, very quick on these sort of deals. So I do think it's going to be a fascinating season as we go forward, working out where everybody else goes.
My money would be on Alonso going to Mercedes.
Yeah.
Well, that's another name that's very interesting. I was hearing them mention. I'm not sure whether he'll go to Mercedes, but there's in the Formula 2, there's Andrea Antonelli. There are loads of eyes on him this year in the Formula 2 season.
I know. That's an interesting one because he's a young, very talented driver. If he does well in Formula 2 this year, there's a good chance. Mind you,
18 this summer.
Yeah, mind you, that's
quite stark.
The big call, because look at George Russell. You know, Mercedes, you know, knew he was very talented, but he had a couple of years with Williams, and you know, developing. And it does take time to develop in Formula One. I think, however good you are, mind you, look at what Lewis did when he went into Formula One.
Yes, but I think even Max Verstappen took his time to develop.
I agree. They had such talent. And it's funny. It's actually thinking about when he first went into Formula One, Lewis, in 2007, and of course he only just lost out on the title to the last driver to win a title for Ferrari, that being Kimi Räikkönen. So that was 18 years ago. And now we've got this sort of, you know, opportunity to see whether Lewis, it will be 18 years ago, when he goes into Ferrari to do what Kimi did all those years ago when he first started Formula One.
Besides movement with regards to the drivers, Ben, there has also been instability over the winter with regards to team principals. As you know, Günther Steiner is no longer the Haas team principal, and there is uncertainty, without a doubt, over Christian Horner's future as the Red Bull team principal. How do you think this may affect the two respective teams?
It is an interesting time, I think. I mean, Günther Steiner going out of F1, I think for some people is a real disappointment. I mean, I know the Netflix Drive to Survive program, you know, he's very popular on that. I really enjoyed reading his Surviving to Drive book that he put out a couple of years ago, or not that long ago. Fascinating bloke. And I do think that somewhere along the line, he may well come back in somewhere. Let's see where, you know, whether he ends up with a team or on the other side in terms of FIA, I really don't know, but I do see him coming back. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the team leadership now, and it does feel to me that you've got more of these kind of engineers now running teams to a certain extent, certainly to go to that team principal role. So Ayo Komatsu, who's now going to be running the Haas team, lovely guy, I know him, and he's a really top engineer. And it's a little bit like James Vowles going to Williams and running the Williams team, you know. So you've got these engineers, and then when you look at, for example, Andrea Stella at McLaren, okay, Zach Brown is the CEO, but Andrea is the team principal, and he's very much an engineer. Look what he managed to achieve last year. So it is fascinating that it almost feels like teams are going a little bit that way, get the engineer to the top, as it were, to really get things organised. But there is the other side to it, that Günther Steiner was such a good guy to hear from and hear the comments from, and he was talented, there's no doubt. His decision-making could be very good, right from the world of rallying when he started, and then getting involved in motorsport. He was involved with Red Bull very early on in they were in Formula One. So, yeah, I can see him coming back somewhere, I have to say.
Okay, Yes, let's speak, Antonello.
Okay, well, there are some
Before I
rumors
speak.
that he might join some media outlet for a couple of races too. I don't know whether you've heard this rumor.
No, I haven't, but it wouldn't surprise me. I'm sure he is very, very insightful and knowledgeable. Maybe Ben will back me up on this. Maybe he's had more direct interaction with Steiner. So I have no doubt he would be a very insightful man in that respect. It's interesting to note your point, Ben, of the engineers. And when you mentioned it, it definitely crossed my mind how Stella's at McLaren. We even in the past had Mattia Binotto, for example, with Ferrari, who's from an engineering background, one could say.
Absolutely. And sometimes that does work extremely well. And, there are quite a few engineers now involved. And even to be fair, I mean, Fred Vasseur, although he didn't work as an engineer in Formula One, he trained as an aerodynamic engineer initially before he started setting up
into management.
Race management, yes, that's right. And you've got Laurent Mekis at RB now, what was AlphaTauri. Laurent Mekis is really kind of running. They've got another guy doing the commercial side, but again, another engineer who's come from Ferrari more recently. So, yeah, I think it is a way that a lot of F1 teams seem to be going. Whether it's the right way or not, I don't know. That's a question for the future.
Yeah, for sure. With regards to Christian Horner, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. I will obviously be very careful on what to say because there's a sensitive nature of the allegations. But recently there have been statements from Formula One and the FIA, indicating a hope for the situation to resolve itself as quickly as possible. So I think it's clear that the situation is quite grave, whatever the allegations, whatever the substance outside is. And you actually mentioned, firstly, I would like to ask maybe how you think this could affect Red Bull. Who could take his place? There is one main name that springs to my mind. That's Jonathan Wheatley. Maybe has that background.
Yeah, Jonathan's a good guy, very smart and very engaged with the team for a very long time. He is potentially, I agree, he could be somebody who could run it. But I do think I'd still feel a little bit, well, we don't know what's going to happen. I do feel that if Christian Horner has to leave for whatever reason comes up,
whatever reason, exactly.
If he has to leave, I do feel as though it will have a bit of a knock to the whole way the team is created and sits at the moment. I do think it will have an effect. I think it can be resolved, as you say, someone like Jonathan Wheatley, who's been part of that team for a long time. Adrian Newey's still there, of course, the man who's behind the design. Whether he would stay there, he may well do. I mean, he's an independent man, even though he's been part of Red Bull for a long time. He's been part of many other teams as well.
Williams and McLaren, among others.
Yeah, I do think that Christian Horner leaving it, I do think could have a bit of a knock on the team in some ways, because it is so much, around him to a large extent as to how that team operates at the moment. It's about getting the right people in the right place, and he works very hard to do that, I think. So we shall see once we find out. Clearly, this is taking a little longer than we thought it might. We thought we might hear quite quickly. We haven't heard yet as to what the resolve is going to be. But there's no doubt that, I think it could be tricky for Red Bull. Not impossible. They could cope with it, whichever way. If he does have to leave, I'm sure they can cope, but it could be a tricky situation.
In fact, as well, it's worth pointing out, Ben, just before I let Antonello speak, he's been the longest serving team principal in Formula One. He's been 18 years, right? 18 years.
That's right.
That's a long time. So, of course, I can't disagree with you that it will have a huge effect. And in fact, it's striking that with all this drama of the team principals, the third longest serving team principal after Toto Wolff, who's second longest at the moment, of course, is Mike Crack, who was only appointed 2 years ago. Funny how the world goes, how Formula One goes in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, Franz Tost, of course, finished at the end of last year, didn't he? So, and he'd been a long team boss for a while. But you're right. I mean, it's amazing how things now turn around much more quickly than they used to. And I think that is part of Formula One, actually. It's such a big empire now, but it's so demanding all the time and all the people involved that it can spit people out, or it can make people just think, right, I've had enough. And even Toto occasionally says, I'm not sure how long I'll continue. He has continued his contract, as we know, but you do get the feeling sometimes with Toto that there's going to come a point where he says, right, I've had enough.
Thanks, Ben, for your response. Now we will take a very short break so that we can go for some adverts. Please stay with us. Beauty Wisdom tal-fgura għall-aħjar prodotti u servizzi ta' sbuħija. Żuru wkoll Nails by Xerawna fl-istess stabbiliment għall-aħjar servizz ta' trattament ta' dwiefer. Wasal eluq żmien ommok, missierek, jew xi ħadd minn tal-familja, għandek xi okkażjoni jew xi attività mal-ħbieb u trid issib restorant tajjeb b'ikel ġenwin u prezzijiet qalb ta' kulħadd? Post wieħed għandek issib il-Katalan tax-Xajra fejn issib għażla vasta ta' pizza, pasta, grills u għaġin f'atmosfera b'element familjari. Għal bookings ċempel fuq 21-800-997 jew żur is-sit tagħna għal iżjed informazzjoni. Il-Katalan, ir-ristorant għalik. Partitarji ta' Napoli, partitarji tal-Arġentina, dilettanti tal-futbol in ġenerali, issimgħu sew, Game Breaker ser iġib statwa unika ta' Diego Armando Maradona, LP Bede Oro. Din l-istatwa, magħmula mill-ħadid u ta' dimensjonijiet 1:10, ser tkun disponibbli mill-aħħar ta' frar fl-istabbiliment ta' Game Breaker ġewwa Santa Venera għal prezz ta' €185. Għal daqstant, jekk tixtieq li jkollok din l-istatwa unika ta' wieħed mill-aqwa plejers li qatrat il-logħba tal-futbol, fittex ibbukja il-kopja tiegħek ta' din l-istatwa ta' Diego Armando Maradona biex ma toħroġx iddiżappuntat. Game Breaker, l-aqwa l-logħob tal-PlayStation, Xbox u Switch.
Ivvota l-individwu li tixtiequ jirbaħ l-unur tal-People's Choice Award fl-64 edizzjoni tal-Għażliet Sportivi Nazzjonali. Il-votazzjoni permezz ta' SMS tagħlaq fl-offsinar fit-2 ta' Marzu. Il-finalisti f'din il-kategorija huma Mario Bonello, Atletika, Clayton Castaldi, Pool, Gianluca Ketkuti, Trap Shooting, Brand Spiteri, Kickboxing, Mattias Spiteri, Ibburdjar, Sophie St. John, Ġinnastika, Colette Sultana, Squash, Tanisha Thornton, Weightlifting, Rona Sherry, Malta Rugby Football Union. Ir-riżultat se jkun determinat bl-għażla ta' 100% tal-voti bl-SMS. Kull SMS jiswa 150 ċentesmu ta' euro. L-Għażliet Sportivi Nazzjonali, is-Sibt 2 ta' Marzu fit-8 ta' filgħaxija, live fuq TVM Sport Plus.
Welcome back for tonight's show. We are with F1 TV journalist Ben Edwards, where we are doing this exclusive interview for our network. Ben, we will now start the second part of our chat by discussing the anticipated challengers for this year's championship, Andrew, since it involves more
Okay.
your team,
Okay.
Mercedes,
I will
it's more
take.
appropriate for you to ask the next question.
Okay. In the case of Mercedes, these are going to go into the season with the backdrop of Hamilton's move to Ferrari for 2025, as we all know, as he gets set to replace Carlos Sainz. How do you think this will affect the team dynamics in Brackley and Maranello?
I think there will be difference in meetings, in some of the organised meetings that drivers go and attend to with engineers. That's where your crucial thing is, because at the end of the day, when a driver is leaving, especially to a big rival team, it's the technical interest, the technical knowledge, and they have a lot, obviously. They absorb it from the engineers. They encourage changes, especially someone like Lewis, who knows what he wants from a car.
And he's been in the team for such a long time.
Yeah, exactly. He's been there such a long time. And they respond to what he wants. He knows what he wants. But they will have to start cutting that off, because they don't want him to know quite where they're going with the car in terms of what the future will bring. I mean, it's an interesting time, because remember, going into 2025, it'll be the last year of this current set of regulations, by which time a lot of the work has been done. We're hoping, and we'll talk about this in a bit, that the teams will be a bit closer this year, because there's only so much you can do under a set of regulations. And once everybody works it out, hopefully the cars get more and more similar to each other and more competitive. That's kind of what you hope. But in 2026, of course, they're under new rules, and it's those new rules, I would imagine Mercedes will be very keen, not for Lewis to know quite what their thoughts are for going with the 2026 car, because they'll know that he's going to be in a Ferrari by then. So I think it will cut down some of the meetings, but I don't think actually it'll make a big difference at Brackley in terms of the mentality, in terms of how they do things. They're very well organised anyway. If Lewis can't go to a few of the engineering meetings, so be it. Lewis is very independent anyway. He always does his utmost and total level at the racetrack at the weekends, and then gets on with his life. And he does that so brilliantly I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. To be honest, I think their relationship will still work reasonably well, even though he's going to be leaving. For Carlos Sainz, it might be a bit harder in some ways, because going out of Ferrari and Leclerc being very much the sort of number one because he's continuing, that could be a bit hurtful, I think. And I think for Carlos, he needs to get something together soon about a contract going on. I'm sure he can do a good job and get somewhere good, but it's something that he needs to really develop and work on and be in a good place next year, 25.
I'm pretty sure that with regards to Sainz, he is a very capable driver who is more than willing to give the answers on the track, despite being, let's say, treated as the number 2 driver. We've seen last year Leclerc getting the pole positions, but ultimately Sainz getting the win. And even in the championships, they were really close. Apart from 22, where Leclerc maybe had that little edge.
Yeah, there were 6 points between them. You're right. There were 6 points between them last year, which seems amazing. Leclerc was the better qualifier, 15-7. But Sainz is a very intelligent driver, and there's no doubt about it. He's smart. And, look at what his dad's achieved, winning a Dakar this year. I mean, they're a family, a motorsport family that have real depth of intelligence in whatever they're involved in, I think.
So let's move on to the next question. And if I have to be honest, it does affect a little bit myself since I'm a McLaren fan. And I'd like to hear from your voice. What do you think about this year? Can the Papayas finally break their duck and secure their first Grand Prix win since 2021?
Yeah, the first win for McLaren for a long time in 2021, because it had been 2012 before that they'd had their previous win, which was Jenson Button in Brazil. And then Daniel Ricciardo got the win you mentioned in 2021. But one win in 11 years. And especially when you look at McLaren, with a total of 183 wins overall, still more than either Red Bull or Mercedes have taken in their careers. And yes, I know McLaren goes further back, but second only to Ferrari. So can they get their first one? Good question, because they had so many second places last year, didn't they? And their performance at Silverstone was fantastic. And then in Brazil, Lando Norris was superb. But Max Verstappen just had the advantage, and it was so difficult to just get that little bit extra to beat Max Verstappen and Red Bull. They were in such dominant form. Can they win this year? I do think it's possible. I think it's possible, but it's not a definite, because when you get into the beginning of a new year, everybody's developed their cars. We know that McLaren developed their car brilliantly. After Canada last year, they were nowhere. And then from Austria onwards, they had a competitive car. It was a fantastic upgrade that they did, and they continued to work throughout the year. But now everybody's had a chance to upgrade. So when we go into the start of the year, it can be very unpredictable as to who's moved up, who's moved down, what works. I do think that there's going to be a chance, though, for McLaren. I think both drivers, Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, are brilliant, and they can snap opportunities when they're there. And the McLaren works really well in certain scenarios. So I think there is a chance. Whether they're going to get that win, we'll find out. But it's a big part, I think, of this year. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, Ben, if I may point out something, as you know, this week we're starting testing. And very often you hear rhetoric in testing, however good or bad it really is for, especially the bigger names, I would say. There's talk of their sandbagging.
And
yes.
Before we continue, I would like to point out that this interview has been recorded Tuesday 20th, before the start of the actual testing, for the benefit of those who will be following our show on Thursday.
Yes. I was saying, there's the perception that a lot of teams are sandbagging. In reality, what do you think the situation would really be with respect to teams? Do they really have an idea? Would they really tend to have an idea of the pecking order by the end of the tests?
The teams normally, when I speak to them sometimes, they normally have put together a pretty good order. They know. But it's because they have so much experience and knowledge, and their computer systems are fantastic, and they put it all in because they can sort of work out what teams might be doing and not doing because they do it themselves, you know. So the teams can quite often work it out, but they don't often let us know. So quite often they keep it quiet. And also, one of the key things as well is getting out and testing. There are often little developments that haven't quite been made in time for the first test. And they will be coming in perhaps for the first or second Grand Prix, even though it's only a couple of weeks later. So
I've heard that the Red Bull will be getting developments for the first race in Bahrain already.
Yeah, and that's very typical of Red Bull. They're very, very good at updating very quickly on whatever they're doing. And the top teams are like that. So we cannot, it's fascinating. I mean, I always love watching the testing and seeing what's going on. But to be honest, you come out of it at the end of it thinking, well, I've got no idea who's going to win, who's not. You still get some ideas, you get some learning, but you really don't know until you get out for the first proper qualifying session.
Qualifying of the season.
Yeah. Then you get that first real picture.
In fact, I remember in 2022, for example, when Mercedes started, I think, very much on the back foot. I think their body language was pretty obvious, the way they talked, and even though some years they've maybe talked themselves a little bit down, I thought in 2022 there was serious recognition. And I don't know, maybe you were in Bahrain in the paddock or involved, or maybe you had contacts who indicated to you maybe what was whether it was really the reality that Mercedes were on the back foot.
No, I think they were pretty aware of it from an early stage, and because Mercedes went for very much their own style, didn't they? And
yes,
it worked in theory in aerodynamics and on simulators, but in reality, I think they were getting very different pictures of what it was like. So I think they picked that up pretty quickly. But I do think that was, as you were saying, that was a key time in that, you know, we were seeing a new development of cars then. When you're getting into this development, and we're into it in a few years, now they all kind of know what needs to be done and doesn't. And although Mercedes is going to be fascinating this year, I think in some ways that is the one to keep an eye on more, because we know how much they've struggled under this ground effect rule that came in then. They haven't really got it quite right since then. But they've made quite a few changes this year, and they've really worked on updating. And it was something Toto was talking about a lot throughout last year when they knew it wasn't going to work the way they'd stayed with it.
In fact, I thought even the rhetoric in last season, especially in the launch, was almost a little bit defeatist. I thought there was an acknowledgement that they were already on the back foot even before the preseason testing started last year. And I'm not sure about this year again, to be honest, the way they've talked. But there's maybe a already a bit of a tacit acknowledgement that they're
But
probably
it's
not
very difficult, because sometimes they'll just be cautious and they don't want. Sometimes even if they're in good
yes, as well. I
even if
understand
they're
that
in good
there's
shape, they will sometimes just be very cautious, we're not sure, because they don't want to put it out there. So I think for all of us, we need to keep a close eye on what's going on with Mercedes.
I think it applies to all the other teams as well.
Yeah.
But you mentioned this episode of Mercedes because I remember
The ones at the top.
Yes, exactly. I think it's especially for the ones at the top. The ones at the bottom, I think it tends to be fairly obvious who's at the bottom, I think, compared to the ones at the top. I don't know how you maybe view this point.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, Haas have been very honest. Komatsu has been talking about it. They've been saying, we know we're going to be down at the bottom because partly because the schedule of the changes they made last year coming into this year, they've been very straightforward about that. So I do think, as you say, that some of the teams we're used to seeing down at the lower end, that we're not about to see them suddenly jumping up. But I do think that at the top end, like you were talking about, McLaren, who we know were very competitive last year, Mercedes, who had moments where it shone, other times where it didn't, but that car didn't really work. Can those teams, and along with Aston Martin, which was in many ways the main challenger for Red Bull in the early stage of last year, they dropped off a bit towards the end. But Aston Martin, again, I think is one that we really need to keep an eye on because their start of the season in 2023 was brilliant. If they've learned what they need to learn from that, they could be in a great shape again.
Thank you.
We've mentioned Mercedes, we've mentioned Ferrari, we've mentioned McLaren, but we should remember also Max Verstappen and Red Bull, who will enter the season as defending drivers and constructors championship respectively. Can or will anyone stop them in 2024?
Can anyone stop Red Bull? That's a big question. I mean, clearly that car has been superb, and we saw just how Red Bull almost dominated every race apart from one last year. And so they really are very, very special. And I think they've got to go in as favourites, to be honest. They've got to go in as favourites once again. The talent of Max Verstappen, the technical side for Red Bull, what a combination it is. And you've got to think that the start of this season is still going to be right up there. Their demand, if you like, to be up there and winning races, I'm sure they're going to be up there. The question is whether other teams have been able to catch up a little bit more. And I do think that's possible. I really do think that's possible, that we could see more of a battle going on. And it's always better if you've got several other teams involved who are splitting up the top teams. If Red Bull have got 1-2 on the grid, they've got each other to help throughout the rest of the race. If they're 1 and 6, which often happens with Sergio Perez anyway, or 1 and 10, or even further back. And that is one of the worries for them, having Sergio, whose qualifying is not always that strong. That's where, they've got to be cautious. If there are other teams that are getting in there with, say, Max is first, but there's another team second and third, suddenly he's in a bit of a trouble because those two cars might be able to work together to give Max a much harder time. And I think that is something we could be watching for. But I agree with you that I think Red Bull are still going to go in as favourites this year.
And you were mentioning with Sergio Perez also, how you're seeing this season. I'm sure he's under pressure to keep that seat. There is Daniel Ricciardo knocking also on that seat, maybe other drivers. How are you seeing the Mexicans' season pan out?
Well, tricky. I think he's really he has got a lot of demand on him, and I wonder whether he's going to be able to hold on if he can't do the sort of qualifying that he needs to do and didn't do all the time last year. He's held on to that contract. He's still there. He's in for this year at the moment. We don't know the details of the contract to the last degree. Nobody ever does. And of course, you've got Daniel Ricciardo as part of the RB team, and that being mentioned every now and then that Daniel could well be brought in instead of Checo. So who knows? Sergio, he's a very talented driver. When the car's right for him, particularly on certain street tracks and stuff, he's fantastic. It doesn't always work on other sorts of tracks. And if the handling doesn't suit his style, there's no doubt he struggles more than Max does. So let's see how the car fits him. I think that's very important in the early stage.
And before we close our short chat, I would like you to maybe send a message to all the Formula One fans in Malta who I'm sure that are following our show tonight.
Well, I think it's a lovely time for all you Formula One fans to be getting back into it. We've all been missing it for a few months, even though it goes crazy through the year. But I really hope you all have a wonderful time absorbing the information from the testing that's going on this week. And then we're into the racing, which is where all the real fun comes up. So I just hope everybody has a very enjoyable 2024 season.
Thanks, Ben, for this interview. Mela, wara li smajna dik l-intervista ma' Ben Edwards, hawnhekk għandna magħna lill-Andrew, li intervistajna lil Ben Edwards, Andrew Zarb l-ewwel nett.
Insellimlek Antonello, passoltu grazzi tal-istedina.
U tajjeb illum nikxef storja żgħira. Aħna kif tafu, parti li għandna l-famuża ċet li jsemmu ħafna YouTubers, hemm ċett oħra tinvolvi l-erba' membri tad-Dipartiment tal-Formula wieħed. Jiena Andrew Dayton u Wade li bħalissa kif nistgħu timmaġinaw kollu għaddejja bejn testijiet, bejn preparamenti u bejn bidejat. U waħda mill-affarijiet li konna qed naħsbu għaliha fil-bidu tas-sena hija li nġibu intervista ma' xi ħadd prominenti mill-kamp tal-Formula wieħed għal dan iż-żmien. U kien hemm diversi smieħ suġġeriti mis-Andrew, kien minnhom qalilna immorru għal Ben Edwards x'taħseb. U minn hawn jew minn hemm irnexxilna nġibu dina l-intervista folderi għad-forsi sequence se jgħid proset Antonello li ma nagħrix ġustax l-ewwel qed proset irridu ngħidu għall-tim kollu. U fuq kollox darba proset il-Andrew illi ħareġ b'din-l-idea ta' Ben Edwards u naħseb il-Drew għandek tuħu l-mertu kollu ta' din il-biċċa xogħol,
Nirringrazzjak ħafna Antonello. Kien ta' privileġġ għalina tnejn naħseb li nintervistaw bniedem bħal da. Jiena insostni li nammira ħafna Ben Edwards, trabbejt nisma' lilu meta kont nara tlilaq tal-Formula 1 nhar ta' ħadd tifisser li kelli din l-opportunità u nur kbira li fl-aħħar mill-aħħar.
Kulħadd nispeċi jkollna personaġġi ta' din karatura illi ġejjin fuq netwerk bħalma huwa n-netwerk tagħna tal-Kamra Sportiva żgur li darba l-ispezzjoni Hardwork Pays Off tot għal dan l-achievement group illi għamilna mela laqjet hawnhekk mhux se ndumu ħafna, mhux se nsuddulkom ħafna ħin illum, però bħalissa għaddejjin it-testijiet ġewwa l-Baħrejn għaddew jumejn semmu fiżet fid-dettall il-ġimgħa d-dieħla tamma x'impressjoni ħadd issa minn dal-jumejn Andrew naraw hekk bilniex.
Red Bull reġgħu jidhru l-favoriti. Jiena qed taqbel it-test u xejn ma biddil li femti minn dal-ewwel jumejn ikolli nammetti. Idru il-ħinijiet ma trix tares lejhom at face value waħedhom ma jidru smooth jidher li it's gone to plan. Illum kellhom xi ftit glitches b'reliability, kellhom xi ftit drivability problems sa fejn għafin u kien hemm xi break fire żgħira ma affarijiet li jiġru waqt it-tests u jissolvew u ġew solvuti peress xorta qatt minn xi 130 lap illum jiġifieri kellhom ġurnata produttiva wkoll u jidher li u il-konsensus madwar il-paddock ukoll biex ngħidlek ġa jidher ċar mill-erba' kelmiet li smajna minn hawn minn hemm li kollha jaħsbu li għal Red Bull għalissa almenu ħanajdu hekk. Ejja ngħidu li jidhru favoriti u tidher ċara dik l-affari.
Imma insomma, sa fuq se nitkellmu l-ġimgħa d-dieħla se jkun hemm kważi t-tim kollu tal-Kamra Sportiva tas-section tal-Formula 1 fil-nazzjoni, programm ħibda fid-disa se jkollna magħna wkoll il-Pierre Vella, il-ġurnalist akkreditat mal-FIA u se wkoll introduċu l-programm tagħna bħala Kamra Sportiva għal din is-sena fosthom is-sigla ġdida illi ser nillonċjaw waqt dan il-programm tal-ġimgħa d-dieħla appuntu għal dawk illi huma il-programmi kollha li ħanoħorġu fit-Formula wieħed fl-2024. Kull ma se ngħidilkom biss din id-darba stennew xi novitajiet. tistennux l-affarijiet tas-soltu. Mela, aħna lista se nifqu hawnhekk, grazzi l-ewwel grazzi mill-ġdid lilek Andrew u grazzi wkoll iż-żewġ membri l-oħra ta' dan it-tim, Wayne Mikallef u Dejt Ziltabone illi l-input tagħhom anke bħalissa fl-off season biex ikollna kollox lest qed jiswa ħafna biex issa il-ġumma diħan nillonċjaw dan il-materjal, imma wkoll din l-intervista hija parti minn dan il-programm li qed inħejju għalikom. Grazzi kbira wkoll tmur l-sponsors tagħna li huma Beauty Wisdom, il-Katalan, Game Breaker u Your Beauty Essence. Infakkarkom tliet affarijiet. L-ewwel nett illi għada inkomplu bil-artikli ta' introduzzjoni illi qegħdin nagħmlu fejn qegħdin nintroduċu tim il-protagonisti kollha ta' dan il-kampjonat, plus il-nkomplu naġġornawkom ukoll x'inhu jiġri fil-Baħrejn u s-Sibt jolħad noħorġu statistika ulterjuri fuq dawn it-testijiet. It-tieni ħaġa li nfakkarkom hija li jekk tliftu forsi il-programm daqsija sija u nofs oħra dan ħajkun disponibbli fuq il-YouTube channel tagħna daqstant tinsewx titlu ta' subscribe ħalli nitilfu fejn minn dak kollu illi qegħdin noħorġulkom tista' tajt ta' kuljum. Botta u risposta jirritorna bħallum ġimgħa fid-9 għal programm nistgħu nsejħulu hekk it-tieni programm ta' introduzzjoni għal kampjonat dinji tal-Formula wieħed panel suppost nkunu jiena Andrew, Wayne u Pierre Vella, forsi nġibu mistieden ieħor sadika naraw naqra bil-kwit aħna. L-appuntament tagħna bħala kamra sportiva magħkom is-segwaċi tagħna imma huwa għal għada fis-sitta fejn Lorjana Brinka tintroduċikom għal programmi kollha li se jkollna matul il-ġimgħa permezz tal-programm il-ġimgħa tal-Kamra Sportiva. Sakemm nerġgħu niltaqgħu, Antonello Abela u Andrew Zarb jgħidulkom il-lejl tajjeb, ħudu ħsieb u niltaqgħu fi programmi oħra iżjed il-qudiem matul il-ġimgħa. Saħħiet. Botta u risposta ġim wassal lilkom bl-isbaħ xewqat ta' Beauty Wisdom, il-Katalan, Game Breaker u Your Beauty Essence.